Somber was the year 1944 in Lithuania. The rumble of cannon shots grew louder and louder, and the German-Soviet front line was moving ever closer. It was obvious that Nazi Germany was approaching its agony, but there were hardly any Lithuanians who believed that the Soviet army would fail to return to the country. We were pretty sure that Lithuania would again find itself in the Soviet claws, but this time we were not prepared to repeat the 1940 mistake and give away our homeland without struggle. Remembering the Soviet terror during the first occupation, many of us chose voluntary exile in the West. The others organized armed groups, and we were prepared to rebuff the approaching Soviets. The most active among them was the Lithuanian Liberation Army. Even though many of us had little hope of putting up a fight against the Soviet war machine, we expected the Western states to notice our struggle as well as Lithuania's striving for freedom. One of the guerrilla commanders, Adolfas Ramanauskas Vanagas, wrote, "We ourselves understand all too well that alone we are far too weak to make a stand against Bolshevism. Nevertheless, not all of us have conceded to being taken to a slaughterhouse like animals. Without the slightest hesitation, we place our confidence in the victory of truth and in the conscience of the free Western world." Unquote. In addition, few people doubted that soon a war would be waged between the Soviets and the West, and during this war Lithuania would be able to regain independence if sufficient determination was demonstrated. This attitude played into the hands of the retreating Germans. In 1944, they armed one of Lithuania's units, called the Troops for the Defense of the Motherland, which was entrusted to defend the front line in Samagitia. 2 regiments of our soldiers were smashed in October 1944. Those who survived, including the future president of Lithuania, Valdas Adamkus, retreated to the west or joined guerrilla formations. After the Soviets had occupied all the Lithuanian territory and declared mobilization in the spring of 1945, about 30,000 armed Lithuanian men left their homes for forests. Big units of fighters, sometimes a couple of hundred strong, used to get involved boldly into battles with the invaders. They used to attack smaller towns and liberate their comrades in arms or deportees. Today historians refer to those 2 years, from August 1944 to May 1946, as the first stage of guerrilla warfare, which was extremely fierce. Battles with the Soviet units would last for several days, even artillery would be employed, there would be hundreds of dead soldiers left in the battlefields. About 200 guerrillas and hundreds of Soviet stock troops were killed in the fights of March 1945 in Azhagay and Labanauras forests with the Soviet NKVD military squads. In an attempt to combat the guerrilla movement, the Soviets started recruiting Lithuanians and forming local defense units. Officially, those units of stock troops were referred to as People's Defenders. But ordinary people called them destroyers, because the Russian word istrebitel meant a destroyer. It was not a serious military force. The guerrillas were much more threatened by the Soviet KGB formations of NKVD and MGB, as well as their agents who infiltrated into their ranks. Since 1946, guerrilla warfare changed its mode. Fighter units split into smaller groups. They equipped well-disguised bunkers in the earth or in farmsteads. In an attempt to preserve their strength, they tried to avoid major clashes with the big Soviet units. Instead, they prepared ambushes. At the same time, their activities became better organized and joint resistance headquarters were being set up. Thus, in February 1949, a Lithuanian military movement for freedom, a military and political organization uniting all the guerrillas, was established at a conference of guerrilla commanders. Jonas Žemaitis was appointed its commander and Adolfas Ramanauskas Vanagas his deputy. Various anti-Soviet publications were published and disseminated as a means of combating Soviet propaganda. All in all, no less than 54 periodicals of different titles were published in the period of guerrilla warfare. The guerrillas wore military uniforms as well as insignia of rank and decorations. Fighters were organized in units, which then were united into district regiments. The Dzūkija and Suvalkija guerrilla districts formed the South Nemunas territory. Samogitians named their battle territory as Western Lithuanian or Sea Territory, and the Highlanders called theirs as Eastern Lithuanian or Highland Territory. Due to endless battles, betrayals and Soviet agents infiltrated into guerrilla units, and the guerrilla forces started growing weaker. More and more talented commanders were killed, and there was a shortage of armaments. In 1948, only about 3,000 guerrillas were left in Lithuania, and by 1949, the last stage of guerrilla warfare commenced. weakened guerrilla units continued their struggle against the Soviet troops for 4 more years. They still managed to deliver hard blows to the Soviets. In 1951, in an ambush in Samagitia, the guerrillas succeeded in killing the Deputy Minister of Agriculture of the Soviet Lithuania, Povilas Ryčius. Guerrillas often succeeded in crossing the western borderland of Lithuania, which had turned into the Iron Curtain and was diligently protected by the Soviet border troops. The breakthrough to the west in 1947 of one of the most outstanding guerrilla commanders, Juozas Lukša-Daumantas, who was taking a letter from the freedom fighters to Pope Pius XII, became legendary. Over there he wrote a book about freedom fighters in Lithuania and titled it Guerrillas Behind the Iron Curtain. At the time when he understood that real assistance from the West would never come, he wrote, "It is not impossible that I also will turn into the dust of our blood-soaked land in my homeland." In 1950 he returned to his homeland after he'd made a decision to die in the struggle. And he did a year later in September 1951, when a traitor lured him and he was ambushed. In 1952, about 1,000 guerrillas were still fighting, but a year later their number decreased to just hundreds. In May 1953, the guerrilla commander Jonas Žemaitis was arrested and shot dead after being tortured. And although some freedom fighters were still in the forests, this date is referred to as the end of guerrilla warfare. Adolfas Ramanauskas Vanagas managed to survive the longest because he fell into a Soviet trap only in 1956 and was shot a year later. 10 years later, in 1965, surrounded by the Soviets and unwilling to surrender, 2 Lithuanian guerrillas shot themselves. The last guerrilla, Stasys Guiga, managed to stay in hiding until his death in 1986. The Soviet authorities were extremely cruel to the guerrillas and their supporters. Desecrated bodies of freedom fighters would be left lying in town squares and only some time later secretly buried in dumps. In the period of anti-Soviet resistance, more than 20,000 guerrillas and their supporters were killed and about 140 inhabitants of Lithuania were deported. Guerrillas killed about 12,000 destroyers and KVD soldiers and KGB officials. For nearly 10 years, Lithuanian guerrillas were all on their own, struggling against the powerful army of an alien country. Even though they lost that hopeless battle, they managed to demonstrate to the world that no one would ever be in a position to suppress their striving for freedom.